Yeah, thank you. So, file format obviously is very important for long-term recoverability of the data, right? And the objectives here are twofold. One is you want to make sure that you can interchange media or different files between different systems, different silos. And second one is to make sure that you can recover, down the future, even without your original archive management system. So the Society of Motion Picture and TV Engineers, they've been working on this archive exchange format, XF, that several good things. One is that it's storage agnostic, supports linear media such as tapes, and also nonlinear media such as optical and flash, and also it supports media with file system or non-file system. So this is kind of standardization that we should rally around.
Great, thanks. Alex, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I think Bang is 100% right that getting around standards is very important. That's the key. The problem is there are so many standards, and every one of the standards want to trump the other standards that change every couple of years. For us, it's always been about how do we make sure that our archive is really secure, and that if you look at all these file formats, how do we ensure they work well in your workflow? That's number one, because you have to produce things every day, otherwise you can't make money. And number two is how do you ensure that you're going to have long-term usage on that? Well, you have to stay with standards, but you also have to influence those standards. So it's really up to the consumer, up to the user, up to the professional to influence those standards and get with the standard committees and make them understand what they need. I mean, I'll give you my favorite one is that in the creative industry, where we talk about print in the early years, there was a little standard called the SideQuest or a hard drive, and then there was a standard called the zip drive and a standard called the Jazz drive. And anybody still have those? How about the floppy drive? So standards are beautiful. I can tell you in the Unix world, there's still a standard called TAR and CPIO, and I can still read those tapes that are 40 years old, assuming I rewrote them a few times. But standards are important, and sticking with large standards are even more important.
Absolutely agree with that as well. Another issue that with all the file formats that come out and the size of the file formats that we're working with, working a digital-based file system and file fragmentation becomes a major issue that everybody probably in this room has either had or will have in the near future. Not only at the professional level, but it's also coming at the consumer level. If you run a TV box up on your DirecTV up on your home theater, you'll find that after time, all of a sudden your movies start to stop and skip and things. So fragmentation is a major issue, and what's important to look forward to in the future is file systems that are actually media aware, that they're sequence aware, they're file aware, they know how to self-maintain themselves.
Yeah, just adding to that theme, I think the biggest dimension of complexity or driver complexity is the scale, the amount of content we're talking about. And I wanted to cite a little anecdote figure. You all follow Dropbox, and you know how many subscribers they have. If you look at the subscribers and the number of files they say that they store, there's only 2 to 3 files per day per person. I can tell you, bigger customers, 50 million files a day transferred. Okay? So we have a huge gap between what are considered the traditional consumer ways of solving these content problems and what this industry does. And I think that sort of gets to all these technology issues that we've been talking about today. And in my view, I think, again, that it's about fundamental solutions that get at dealing with this scale of content, but still, in a way, being able to exploit the low-cost IT systems that we have. And there are these large technical gaps that have to be overcome in order to do that.
Okay, what's also going to help, I'm going to take the object storage approach here, is to separate, or to rule out the file system. With an object storage approach, you're typically going to have your application talk directly to your storage, and it's going to allow you to design your storage to scale, to be efficient, to provide high throughput, and you don't have to worry about a file system, because you provide a simple REST API, HTTP access, and all the other smart things that we now have to put into the file system can be led over to the applications that are being used.
I don't have much to add on the file format. I actually started my career about 20 years ago in the high-end video editing business. So when I heard Alex go through all the different formats, my first reaction was, is that it? I thought it would be a lot more than that. Looking at it from a perspective of what our customers are seeing today, I think seeing a lot of file formats is definitely a big problem. Validating and verifying that the file hasn't changed or is still readable after 10 years, 20 years is by far the biggest headache that a lot of media companies I think we deal with. I think what we're seeing a trend is, besides the scalability of using object-based storage, is the fact that a lot of our customers are now finding creative ways of making the replication, the scaling, and the verification of those formats somebody else's problem. So by moving, for example, to cloud storage, it's much easier for them to then move that responsibility, that SLA, from their internal services to something more of a managed services or an outsourced service. So that's something that I think I've seen several different types of SLAs that people have negotiated very creatively, so that instead of worrying about all the different formats, which everybody still has to worry about anyways, but instead of worrying about the workflow and everything else, they're making that somebody else's problem.
I'd like to build on something that Randy said. The issue of archive is to make sure that a file or any content basically is reliable, that is readable years to come, sometimes in the future. When you look at that, in terms of that, there are a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, you want to make sure that your content is a extensible format in its highest resolution possible that you can have. You want to eliminate basically the artifacts associated maybe with encryption or not encryption, compression, or transcoding or what have you. And you want to put that basically on a medium format that by itself is also extensible sometimes into the future. And at the same time, there's another important piece to that you want to make sure of and that is the issue of migration, which is something that oftentimes has a negative karma associated with that, but it is also the very tool that makes sure that our content, what we have, is readable sometimes in the future, because it is that migration tool that lends itself to the future technology upgrades and application that makes it available and accessible. So you got to make sure of that.
Thank you. So, and then my next question to you guys is kind of a two-part question, and some of you already have touched upon it, but you can go into detail. One is like the myths of costs of storage and data protection over time, and how can I ensure that my content is safe and I'll be able to access it now and 10 years from now?
Yeah, well, it's so complicated and costly because the storage media gets damaged, especially over a long time. So obviously you have two kinds of things to protect against that. One is you need to make sure that your storage system has some kind of automatic error recovery based on ECC or some other technology. The second thing is really just redundancy. You have to make sure that you have a replica somewhere either near your facility or far away from the facility, and that incurs costs. And especially for metadata, you don't want to lose it, and you want a lot of redundancy, because if you lose metadata, you can't get to your data. So that's a whole lot worse than losing your data.
Mary, it's a very interesting subject because most of us could talk for a few hours on this. But the simplicity of this is that realistically, it's all about best practices. And what we find, and I think Bob touched on this a little bit before, most of the facilities we deal with, even the large facilities, have a very minimal IT staff to be able to manage this. And they also don't necessarily subscribe to the thinking of large data centers. In my earlier career, I was a DBA in a very large data center in the banking industry. And the interesting thing about it is Five9's reliability was just taken for granted. We believed in Five9's reliability. I can tell you studios that we have today that literally are quote unquote putting the job in the can half an hour before it goes up on the satellite, before it goes on the air. And one glitch, and basically, you know, we have a rerun going. So just maintaining that content and being able to handle it for the short term is what they worry about. Handling large archives and being able to manage this over time is really a best practice exercise, and being able to afford to be able to say, this is what my true cost is going to be. So the TCO is really about true cost, and it's not a solution of, well, tape is cheaper than disc, or disc is faster than tape. It really is a blend of being able to build that best practice together, and it will take time before this all comes out. I mean, we don't have stone tablets that are going to last 2,000 years anymore. Nobody's hard drive is going to last more than 5 years on the shelf or running, and nobody's tape is really going to last 3 to 5 years unless you're going to rewrite it. So these are just the facts. You know, I worked on a project, and I'll make it quick. I worked on a project with Sony many years ago, and we took some archive, some really interesting stills at the time, and they guaranteed us that the CDs we were writing were good for 100 years. They came back a year later and said, you know what, we made a mistake. They're really good for about 2 years. So the 35 file cabinets that we had at this very large studio, we rewrote all of that for free. So it wasn't quite a lot of fun. So I can tell you, there is no one easy answer.
And it's not a myth, it actually does cost money. So last year I was down in Burbank, and it was really funny because I went to two very large companies about a mile apart from each other. And for whatever coincidence, I walked into the first one and we were talking about a number of requirements that they had, and he brought out this white paper that he had written internally to the business that emphatically proved that long-term archive on disk was the least expensive way to archive media for long-term. And so we talked about it and went back and forth, and you know, he had a white paper this deep that went through all the analytics of why that was true. And so then I went to the other facility, and again, it was just a coincidence. We're talking, and he throws out a white paper that he had done. And that white paper stated that backing up on tape was by far the cheapest way to maintain an archive long term. So there you have it. Is it clear? So in the end, what it really means is exactly what Alex was saying. It's best practices, and some companies will find that archiving on disk for maybe 2 or 3 years and then going to tape, and from tape to shelf is the best thing for their business. Or it could be that they move from disk after 6 months, or it could be that they have 5 years of disk. So it's best practices based on your business model, and there's plenty of people out there that can kind of help you ask the right questions so you can figure out how you're going to do it. But it is going to cost you money. You are going to migrate over time. Technology is going to change, and what we have today will be really different than what we have 10 years from now.
Yeah, I want to try to address this from the angle of the data movement, because obviously we don't make storage a Despera, but we are directly involved with this whole solution. And I think this has been said very well by the other panelists. I mean, the business aspects of this, firstly, are critical, both to the present and the long-term success of this entire industry. And there's sort of 2 to 3 different aspects that are necessary in order to make this business functional. It's the availability of the data, often accomplished through redundancy, the access to it when you need it, or the latency, as Alex said, and then the predictability of being able to achieve those 2 things, right? And that's also crossed with the fact that it's at such massive scale. And I say all this because that is part of the reason that this ought to cost money, because it's both complex and it's also integral to the business process. And we come in a world that, first of all, used to be free. Back in the days, people used FTP, and then became cheap through all kinds of simplistic acceleration, data blasters, etc. When you start to look at the cross product of those things combined with the scale of data, you start to see why the investment is worthwhile. And I also put down one of my anecdotes. One of my customers I see out here, I know for a fact they have to replicate to their geographic backup sites 40 million files plus 8 million new files per day, per week. So you can easily calculate where that's going to be within a few weeks' time. It's such a massive amount combined with these things that obviously the investment is part of it. The other piece are these technology aspects we've been talking about.
All right.
I think most of the elements have been mentioned. So there is cost and safety, also latency. If latency is not an issue, then we're probably still for a good couple of years be using tape to build our archives. But as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of companies are looking to build archives for their data that are more active and faster accessible. So their disk is the obvious solution, but now we have the problem that with big data, with which everything has been mentioned today, with the issue of big data, we need more and more storage, and if we're using traditional systems based on rate, then we are using a lot of overheads to make sure that all our data is safely stored. So I think part of the answer here is new technologies, and one of the new technologies that is coming up and which we are also using is erasure coding to really reduce the overhead that is needed to store your data safely, and which enables you to build live archives that are almost as cost efficient as more passive archives as we know them on tape today.
I don't have much to add to that. I think in general, Panzura is really on the this camp of archive. What we've seen from our customers is the fact that if you have a staff that's very, very knowledgeable, that's been around for a long period of time, I think there's many different ways of achieving something more inexpensive than some of the offers that we heard. But however, in general, one of our customers, a very large media company, just bought another very large media company. There was just a lot of movement, a lot of IT confusion. In those cases, they actually went back and looked at their tape archive of these 350 gig media files. Some 15 to 20% of those media files were actually in some way, shape, or form corrupt. And so the cost of coming back to what they had before the masters to generate those files again just completely blew out the cost structure. And so what a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, what a lot of them are now doing is finding ways to move that responsibility elsewhere, and then they can negotiate a managed services from that standpoint, and then make sure that whoever they contracted does their job from a, not just from a reliability and scalability standpoint, but they go back and make sure that from a weekly basis or monthly basis, they go back and verify that the files that they wrote out are indeed there and they're actually there.
I thought Alex did a great job on explaining basically what typical environments are. With that said, nothing is constant or fixed. The only thing that is fixed is basically changing itself. Things change, environments change, requirements change. The only thing I can say here is that you got to put an architecture and a solution in place that can adapt basically based on needs. A couple other things that are important in terms of security content long term is that replication itself is not security. It's not the safest thing that you got to make sure of that. As I mentioned earlier, migration is an important part of content security and availability over time. You've got to make sure of that as well. With that said, I don't know if I can add much more to Alex and add a bit.
Great, thank you. We have a couple minutes left here, so I want to make sure we address some of the questions from the audience members.